past, present, and future of the PDGA technical standards. And I'm going to try to cram this into a pretty brief overview as much as I can for this. But thanks a lot for inviting me to speak here, Mike. Go ahead and get started. Well, I wanted to acknowledge some of the other key people that I've worked with on technical standards over the year. Our current committee, or now it's been changed to the Technical Standards Working Group of the PDGA. First and foremost, I got to put Stork up there. He didn't join the technical standards until after he left WAMO, and this was like 97. But, or he was with Intel, I guess, at the end for WAMO. But he was really involved in technical standards from the beginning, way before me, and way before I became technical standards chair. So he certainly had a major involvement. Kjell Soderholm is Swedish, and he's put together what we call colloquially the Swedish database. And if you've never seen that, he put together the most complete database of discs at the time. I would have to say now with the Flying Disc Museum, the numbers in the Flying Disc Museum really are way beyond what Kjell done. But he put together a lot of very detailed information on discs that proved very useful for the Flying Disc Museum as well. And of course, I'm sure almost everybody knows Mike Downs. He's the Deputy Executive Director of the PDGA. He recently got a promotion to that. So he's basically second in charge. But I've liked working with him. And I first met him actually 20 years ago when he came to the 2020 or the 2003 Pro Worlds here in Flagstaff. And then came from Delaware, and then he came back to school and studied recreation, and I was with the PDGA really quite well. But certainly want to acknowledge Mike Hughes and all of the curators at the Flying Disc Museum for inviting me. And as Mike mentioned, I met him when I first moved here in Arizona, which was 1988. I mean, he was really the man as far as organizing disc golf here in the state of Arizona. And he, I don't know if it was mentioned before, but he was the co-TD of the 1990 Pro Worlds in Phoenix. So he had pretty good involvement. And I think he was like a top 10 player, 3 times if I'm not mistaken. But I also wanted to acknowledge the other people, former members, and I think is it 3 or 4 PDGA or Hall of Famers, Chuck Kennedy. Hedrick was God, basically. He decided what we could use, and that meant that it was WAMO. And then, of course, when he started making Midnight Flyers, it was the DGA discs were okay. But I'll move on. Certainly, what I see as a watershed year was really 1983 in our development. That was the year of the first beveled disc, and it wasn't clear that was going to be allowed, but in the end, Tom Monroe and Levon Wolf decided that they were going to be the TDs for the 1983 Worlds. And so a month before the tournament, they said that any disc that met the standards, the true standards that existed, would be allowed. And so, that meant, and they said that the bevel disc would be allowed. And so that gave Innova, they were allowed to be used in the Worlds that year. But people didn't really know how to throw them. They didn't know that they were really better. It looked like they could be, but people didn't really know how to throw them right off the bat. It took a few months after that. But then moving on, steady ceded control to the PDGA, to the membership. That was certainly a big thing that happened. And I see that as a really key year. And actually, how it affected me is Ted Smethers told me that of all the top level pros, he knew that the heavy weighted discs not being able to be used hurt me more than the other single pro around. And this happened just a few weeks before the Worlds, and so I boycotted the Worlds, and I thought I really had my best chance to even win at that time. But I did come back into it. It was in my blood. I couldn't stay away. I had to work on my backhand. I was known for the thumber. I never teed off with anything but a thumber until 1985, so it was all thumbers, really, except for putting, the really short shots. But So I wanted to talk about the bald eagle. That was these were the first bevel discs that were ever made. And these very first bald eagles were test discs. They really weren't sold to the public. In fact, the one on the right was one of about 20 that was first made. And they were sent around to people around the country. They wanted to get feedback. They hadn't sold discs. It wasn't even in it. It was champion discs. They later changed it to the champion. But there's only about 80 of those discs that exist, 20 in each of those four colors. The three colored ones came after the end of one of those. So if you have one of those, that's a big collector's item, and that's certainly one of the premier discs in my collection that I have. So in 1984, this was a list that was published of all the approved discs. It really doesn't list the Midnight Flyers, but it does have the molds, and so they were automatically allowed as well, the Midnight Flyers. So I put in photos of a lot of these that are in the photos that Mike Hughes has taken for the museum, and then I put photos of the 3 discs that were illegal at that time, made illegal. A number of them was because they were too small. They were less than 21 centimeters, and that was one of the very early standards. That plus the weight limit that came in, and also the disc had to have a rim depth that was at least 5% of the outside diameter. We didn't want people throwing record albums. I don't know if you've ever thrown. They fly far, but they kind of cork in there, and they're almost uncontrollable. So really, that rim is a key thing for stability, and I think it would be a safety issue if they didn't have one. And again, it makes it better because you can control them better. How many know of the Phaser? There's some here, but that was a disc that came out, but they never submitted it for PDGA testing and approval, but there was nothing in our standards that would say that it wouldn't be allowed. You can see how sharp that thing is. A lot of them are very, very stiff too. You can hardly bend them. I think that one may be one of the more flexible ones. I think some of the black ones. But we started thinking that maybe this is something we need to write in standards. Why this couldn't be. And so that became an issue later. So here are just discs for pre-1990. So these are all discs that came out before I started doing the testing. But I would have to say there's quite a number of these discs that they weren't on the list of approved discs, and I had to try to obtain them and get the measurements for them too, so that they could be listed. So I think it's roughly about 90. Mike, I think, knows the exact number how many discs before, but I even tested all the original ones because a lot of things we had new tests, and every time we came up with new standards, I had to go back to the old disc and get new data, so it was always going back. Just really trying to figure out what it is that we needed to be doing. So in the 1990s and 2000s, I wrote the first technical standards document, and we've continually modified that over time. Originally, tech standards went into the rules. I don't know if you knew that, but they didn't really want it there, and then I tried to move a lot of things into a separate document apart from the rules. I'll skip ahead to the flex and sharpness standards. That was looking like it's something that we needed to do, and I actually worked pretty closely with Stork on that. He really made some really nice innovations on how we ended up testing that. I went out and met with them at Whammo when he was there at that time. Let's see. Something that I've recommended over years is variant testing. And what a variant is, what I mean by that is a disc that comes out in a different plastic type from what it originally was. Often the manufacturers must think that that's a reason to distinguish it because they'll modify the names of it. It'll have the original model name that was approved, but then they'll change it somehow. And so, I thought that if they're going to, be making discs out of stiffer plastic, well, we need to have a chance to test that kind of thing. And so, it was later approved. I think I get to that later. We did. Okay, well, here's a lot of these discs aren't necessarily the best discs for flying. I mean, people, are doing AVRs and rocks and eclipses and others. But the discs that I'm really highlighting here are ones that really, how they bared on the technical standards and the standards that we came up with. Let's see. Yeah, we did a detailed poll of the stakeholders in 2008, and we wanted to know, we were willing to modify the standards. We wanted to know what people thought. And one thing that was in particularly more controversial, and it's the biggest pain probably for the manufacturers and for me in testing, is the flex test. I know that more discs fail on that than anything else. And that's probably true to today. I'll skip on. This is the article that I wrote. Actually, I wrote it at the end of '93 and it was published in '94 on those the standards for the sharpness and how we measure that using the 16th inch radius gauge. Anyone remember that article here? This is from the Flying Disc Museum. I thought it was pretty neat. They have a gallery that just shows the leading edge of the disc. So for golf discs, that's the key part to really know what's really happening in the disc. And it's nice to see the top and the bottom, but to me, that really shows what really matters in disc golf. This is all of the equipment that I use in testing, and that's actually a published photo in the tech standards part of PDGA.com. And these were the very first discs that I had gotten to test. I started doing tech standards towards the end of '89, but I didn't get any discs until 1990. And these were the very first ones. Now, some of these are discs that actually had come out before, but then they, say for example, some of the Discraft discs, they came out with certain modifications later. I have the Dimple was one of the very early discs. And that was the first disc that was ever removed from PDGA approval. And I really tried to get Jan Sobel to make them in discs that would pass the flex test. When it was approved, we didn't have the flex test, but then he had ones that were super stiff. You couldn't even hardly bend these things. They'd be like 60 pounds of pressure, and they're not even doubling over to get that flex test measurement. So, and I actually extended the deadline quite a long time, so that he could try to, get them to pass, but he never did. So that was the first one that we ever removed. There's the close-up of the Dimple. It actually didn't fly too bad either, right? I met him, Jan Sobel, at the Beach Bowl, and he was giving out a number of them, and we got to give distance demos. It was mostly freestyle. Are you familiar with the factored discs? People here, right? I just want to tell you one story about that with Ed. Ed was the person that I had the most difficulty bringing him into the fold, so that he would try to get his disc to comply with the standards. It's just because, he had been in charge of it all, what he said went. He didn't really understand that he had to jump through these hoops or they weren't going to be tested and approved. So in '92, he had donated these factored discs at the AM Worlds in Indianapolis. But I had thought I mailed a list of what all the approved discs were to the TD, so he knew what could be used. And when he saw those discs, he said, those discs are not on the list. They can't be used in this tournament. So I'm sure Ed's, steeping over that. So, the week later, the Monday after the tournament, he calls me up. And we usually talked. He'd call me up probably about once a month. We'd have a half-hour conversations on all kinds of different topics. I'm usually him trying to get me to do certain things, which I always heard him out, and I rarely did exactly what he wanted because there's other companies involved. It wasn't just his interest at that time. But so when Ed told me what they were, I didn't know anything about it. And then he described what had happened. He had shaved several tens of thousands of an inch, off these discs. These are enema discs, but it's maybe a little hard to see, but he put a little small hot stamp on it that says they're factored. And those original discs are over there, at least two of them that you can see. And I said, Ed, you could consider that an intentionally modified disc, and then then when he saw that maybe I might not be inclined to approve it, he said, he threatened to sue me and the PDGA over this. And I said, Ed, the second you sue me is the second I resign. I do this as a volunteer. I have enough headaches in my same job. I didn't need that. So in the end, we thought about it, and we did end up approving it. And what we decided is that we would just consider that the last step in the manufacturing process, but it's something very different from any other injection molding itself. So let's see, moving into the 2010s and 2020s, finally I was able to convince the board that we should to require the variant testing. But months later, a number of the big manufacturers really pitched a fit, put a lot of pressure on them, and they ended up reversing that decision a few later. And so we ended up making it to where you can get the variant approved if you want to, but it's on a voluntary basis. So there are a mix of original models, but also variants. And they don't get charged anything, the testing on that. Then of course we had first disc with electronic components. It wasn't really revolutionary, but people want to send me something, a component that can be moved between discs, and I've never been willing to do that because I think that, putting that on there itself can even affect the flexibility test, and it can vary between discs. So I said that it had to be specific to a certain disc. And, you may be familiar with the Tobu discs now that have come out, and they're really, some of them are just lighted discs, but they have the smart disc too, which has a lot more features. I don't know if that will be revolutionary, but it's a pretty interesting disc. I don't know how they really fly because I haven't thrown them. Major things that have happened more recently, I won't say too much about this, but I will say that we've done tests that really showed that golf discs are safer than a lot of other projectiles. And it's based on this, what's called a head injury criterion score. Justin Minichelli is who did that, and I supported to do it. But what they did is they shot discs out of a cannon at a dummy. They're the same kind of dummies used in car tests, and they can measure the force that comes in. And they end up getting two measurements, and it's ratio data, one over the other is the score. But the nice thing about it is it lets you compare the disc to all other projectiles. And I think at the worst, a disc came out 9 on this test. A softball, I'm talking the hard softballs they use in like women's softball in college, those are 54. So that tells you how, you can divide 9 into 54. That's how much more dangerous the softball is. And like Stork was telling me that I think about 8 people a year die just from being hit by a golf ball. It's typically someone gets hit in the head, you get bleeding on the brain, and sometimes that leads to death. We've never had a death due to being hit by a disc that I know of. Early on, Stork thought we were one baby away from death from getting all kinds of courses pulled around the world. Luckily, it's never happened. Knock on wood, I hope it never does. But it could, I hope it doesn't. One thing we did at the start of the pandemic is we set up the disc database. Before, everything I just did on spreadsheets, and I'd have to upload an Excel file and PDF file after every approval. It got very tedious. So that was a big help to me. But before, I was always trying to get this done, but the people in IT and the PDGA, they were in such demand, and there were other priorities outside of the tech standards. But this actually, the PDGA had to lay off a number of people, but they kept some people, and this was a great opportunity. And luckily, to me, Joe Chargaloff supported that. And not only do we have it to where they're online, but now if a company wants to get a disc approved, now they can go online, fill out a form, a PD or a Excel file is created just like our old system, and it's a link is sent to where I can download that automatically. And this happens a few seconds after someone submits it, so I know when I'm supposed to be expecting something to come. And let's see, 2021 we had the first 3D printed discs made right in the Phoenix area. And they were set up in Flagport. I don't know if you saw some of those discs. Okay, yeah, this is really mind-boggling. There are 149 disc brands with PDGA approvals, and all but 22 of those are still active. I mean, a lot of these are very recent. Some of them may not last, but it shows you it's a pretty good business to get in. And we all know what happened during the pandemic. And the big companies, 6 and 7, the reason those peaked up, that was when Quest came out and put out 26 discs in 2 years. And then it kind of leveled back out and even back to where it had about been before. But you can see we're rising up steeply. I really wonder how many we're going to end up with at the end of the year. Within our committee, we've made predictions amongst ourselves, and I don't know, whoever wins, I'll probably give them a disc or something. But I think Shell predicted 312, Mike Downs 400, and I predicted 346. And I think my prediction, why that is a steeper rise. It's really a big change here recently. And this really gives you an example of the pandemic effect. I had 13 new brands in 2020, and that was a record. I think it tied a record. And then the next year, 25 and 2021, that broke a record. Broke another record last year, 28 brands. Now these are both targets and discs, but predominantly discs. And this year, right now, I have 16 that have approvals, and I have 3 that are pending, and 2 of those are targets. This is a figure I put together just using that database. I haven't redone it, but it shows you month by month 15 of these slides. And these are only through 2017. There's a whole lot of other new companies that were listed in the slide on the pandemic effect. I know you're not going to be able to make out all the details, but actually the first 90 that I tested are over there that you can go look at. And the majority are prototypes, but I call them test discs because it's whatever they send me. I don't dictate what they send me, but sometimes they have hot stamps. But I think I calculated at one time that it's about 68% don't have any stamp at all, and I think 8% have the name of it handwritten on there, the magic marker, and the remainder have hot stamps. Well, of course, now we get even other different types of art on our discs. Let's see, here's the next set. You can see the variation in color really quickly too, but I would say the last 4 or 5 years, the majority are white. They probably outnumber other discs here and today by probably 2 to 1. I would say white discs versus any other color. These are all NFA, and they have more than that. I think they have 169 approved discs. Not surprising, it's the most of any company. I just put them all in alphabetical order because he had them in the gallery that way, so I just did screenshots. So I was able to show a lot of discs. So what do you think are the big changes in golf discs since the late 70s? Any ideas? Yeah, that's certainly one. Well, I did some statistics, just put together these graphs. I didn't do it on the double disc, but what this is, it shows the major trends since 1975 to 2020. I haven't updated it past that, but I don't think it's changed very much. But what that's really showing you, I have a regression line. I think it's a polynomial regression line. But where you see all of the dots, that's what the average number was for that year, for each of those measurements. Not what the most aggressive would be, but really what the average was. And you can see it's very obvious how much smaller they've gotten, mostly stiffer, and lots sharper and shallower rim depths. And of course the weight limit is lower because most discs are really close to 21. I haven't even looked this up lately, but when I did this last year, there was something like 350 approved discs that are right at 21 centimeters. And if you go up to 22, that's 21.2, that takes in a whole lot of other discs. So that's probably, I would say, half of them right in that size range. So there's a much narrower range. I didn't expect quite these same trends. Stork did when we came up with the sharpness standards. He thought they were going to mostly come in right at that, mostly sharp, and he was right. I thought, man, there's so many other things that you can make. Why wouldn't you? But it's all about distance, I guess. Any guesses on what the most common
stiffness?
What? Stiffness. And it definitely is and was, and I kind of knew that, but I recently made a list of all of them. I'm not going to show it all here, but this is a pie chart that really showed it. Didn't show all the. Well, I'm not missing any numbers, but two of these things, I'm not sure if you know, the radius gauge and the rim configuration test, they're both getting at what the sharpness is of a disc. But they get at different aspects of it. And the reason Stork thought that we really needed to have both is because if we only had the rim configuration, if we had a disc that was pretty blunt and it had a high enough number to pass on the rim configuration, but then it has a needle nose-like projection that comes out, well, that would be kind of dangerous. So, we just thought common sense, we can't have it be that sharp right on the leading edge. And so that's why we also have the 16th inch radius gauge. So it basically has to be an arc of 1/8 of an inch, semicircle. It can't be any sharper than that, or it won't pass too. And things, they often will fail both, but they can actually fail one or the other. Done this enough that happens.
With the sharp edge is okay.
What's that?
Blunt with the sharp edge is okay.
If it meets the radius gauge and the rim configuration, it does. It has to be both. And I will say, I'm not going to try to embarrass any of the companies that fail, but every big company's had discs fail. And I think, if they're trying to make one right at 21 centimeters, and if it shrinks a millimeter, it's not going to pass, or even a half a millimeter. If it's less than 21, it's not going to pass. And sometimes I get discs fail multiple times, but I've actually had, and this was it kind of shocked me. I would have thought it was more like 5%, but it's actually closer to 10% of the time the discs come to me, they fail. And for different reasons. I think sometimes you get so many new manufacturers, they may not really understand the tech standards, and particularly if they're in a different country, like China. It's a very big cultural difference from here, but. I was always expecting more and more companies to be established in China. I know that they make discs for other companies in China. I don't know what that percentage is, but it's pretty substantial. But I think sometimes they just don't understand it. They may have already been making a disc, and sometimes I actually try to recruit them and get them to be PDGA approved when I find out about them. Try to bring them in the fold, but they don't have to do that. And I think sometimes they just send what they have, and if they're too stiff, they don't pass. Oftentimes. Well, we all know that Innova has more than any other, but here's a figure that I put together. It shows you really how far above than that they are. And you can calculate this in different ways, because MVP has more than one brand within them. Remix, Streamline, Axiom. So if I lumped all those together, theirs would certainly move up quite a bit. But you can see I have a lot of companies that have about close to 25 or so, but only a few that really get up above 50. And I'd say probably in the last 10 years, I think Prodigy has had more discs approved over the last decade than any other company. Discraft and Innova don't need to as much, I guess. They really have a lot of it covered, but they still want to come out. There's half a dozen or so a year. And there are 24 brands with 8 to 19 approved discs. 37 with 5 to 7 approved discs, and then I just list the number with, there's 25 with 1 disc, for example. This was a figure I put together. I don't expect you to be able to read it all, but what I'm really trying to show you is, what I was trying to figure out is how many discs are actually made by the company for other brands, or either other brands that they own. And you can see, of course, by that standard, Innova is still number 1. And when I did this was in 2020. This actually took me a lot of time to put together, believe it or not. It was hard to just get it formatted right. I wanted it to be readable, Okay. Anyway. So how many countries have brands, would you think? Any guesses? That have been approved?
23.
23?
33.
33. It's not a bad guess. It's high. It's actually 18 countries. There's 22 countries that have approvals, but 4 of them only targets. It's very disturbing to see. But I helped build a disc tossing machine, and I'll show you a picture towards the end on that. And I see it could have a number of different possible uses. One that I think, I'm not really happy with the flight numbering systems. To me, it's an opinion. It may make intuitive sense, and they may be about right as far as the differences. But being a scientist, I really like more precise data. And so what I'd like to see is using a machine and try it with different spins and speeds and shoot them out there and see what happens. Use an RFID so that you can track what it's really doing, what the spin is, what the angle. There's a lot of things that we can do with that. And actually, we have a machine now, and it can putt better than you can. For me, it will make it every time. I mean, that's not why we did it, but I was shocked how good. We can fine tune it, but it flies different. It puts more spin on it than a human. But once you tinker with it, it'll go right in. But it puts so much spin when it hits, it can kind of stall out, and the backlash of the chains can move it back out unless you get it really dead on. But once you do, it'll stay in there. And I thought it was crazy how well that worked. Don't want to say too much about this, but something I spent a lot of time on in the last year was on post-production modifications, and that's become a big issue. All these, it's hard to keep up with all the new technologies. UV printing. I had to learn about that. And you can print over the entire disk now, but it doesn't put much ink on it. And when I learned it's an inkjet printer, but it's cured with UV. And that's what they call it. Not really UV printing. To me, it's a little bit of a misnomer, but that's what they mean by that. And that's really coming on, and you have some amazing art for that. But I'm not going to go into any details. But what I will tell you, I spent about 300 hours on a proposal that got shot down, but I still think that it might get accepted. But I just think it's something that we have to deal with because there's certain ambiguities. What are the limits? Can you put decals? Can you put stickers on it? Is it okay to dye it? We didn't dye a disc. I mean, it's been accepted that you can, but how much weight does it add? Some people tell me nothing, but I know a disc can take on 2 or 3 grams of water alone. And I know that I've heard that dyes can sometimes add like 5 grams. So my only concern about it is that you start with a disc. If you're adding that many grams, you need to still stay within the total limit. And right now, we really don't gauge that. We don't have a finger on the pulse of that whatsoever. And I think it needs to change. Yeah, we haven't done that much on enforcement, I mean, one thing I don't really like as the tech standards chair is being like the disc golf police, but I do it to some degree when I'm told that something is, if someone mails me one and I see that it doesn't meet the standard, I always will contact that company. I don't do it just on hearsay, but I ask them what kind of quality assurance, what kind of program you have for that. And sometimes it's just they're not really checking enough, when they get a few grams in here. Remember when Dr. Rick was on tech standards, he pointed that out, and I knew this is true, that it'd be a bell-shaped curve for all those different weights. So out on that tail, some of them are just not going to pass, automatically. But I don't know, I think some of them will regrind them, as I know that others don't. They already have a disc weight when they sell it, but they really shouldn't. But one thing I do want to say on that line, and this is an argument that I use to try to get the manufacturers to take this more seriously, these standards. And they mostly do. I mean, it wasn't a given that we would have cooperation with them at the very beginning, working with Stork. I mean, he thinks that's a big success story for us, that we all do work together. Some companies don't want very much government, but I think they bought in that it's to their benefit, to levels the playing field with these other companies to do that. But I think there will be changes in the future, but it probably, I have a typo. But I don't know when this is going to happen. I mean, in '83, right, after the weight limits, how many of you are out there grinding your discs down, putting them on the triple beam? I mean, there was a while that, TDs had the triple beam, and you had to put your disc on there. And I was one of those people putting it on the sidewalk and trying to grind it down those last few grades. I didn't want to grind off any more than I had to. I mean, you're not really supposed to do that, but I didn't want to not throw my 50 volts that were, really close to the limit. Anyway, we'll see what happens on that. And I'll be happy to work with the PDGA, but I'm going to need a lot more help on that in the future. All this is one thing that I think what I would like to see in the future. It's not going to really totally substitute for testing, but if we did detailed 3D scans with a high resolution scanner, and the technology's there. These are just some that I found, and I put a green dot by ones that had what I considered enough of a scanning area. I mean, it has to be able to do a whole disc, the size that we're using, and they have to, I want a very high resolution, so you could actually take all your measurements just from this on the computer. You could do every test with this 3D data except the flex test. That alone you would have to have it in hand. We were actually pushing the technology on this ourselves in archaeology, and these are some of the 3D scans we did. And these were things that were acceptable to Native Americans too, because they don't like photos published of areas, and I understand that. So, but in this, we can make renditions that are close but not the same. It's not a photo. We could actually make them look just like a photo. They can be done in RGB, and they would be the exact same as a photo, but we don't turn that on. But these are some artifacts in a project in California, not the rabbit, but that's just an example of what really stood out. One is the Getty, the Conservation Institute. They're doing some really, and there's a website you can go to look at it. And then I contacted one of the conservation archaeologists at the Arizona State Museum, and they suggested this other site called Pop Art. And these are really for museums. They're plastic sculptures and things. So, it's a big deal, and they want them to last. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I found data on why discs become sticky over time, and it's from this outgassing. Materials, plasticizers. They add things to soften discs, make them more bendable and durable. And some materials, most discs have some porosity, some a lot more than others, but they can outgas and take materials with them. They get deposited. There was a big going in, and people couldn't believe it, how accurate it was. This was 80 feet away, right? Santa Cruz River Park. Well, I'm coming close to an end here. I just, in closing, I'm not going to summarize everything I said, but I tried to cover some of the high points on the past, the present, and the future, at least as I see it. And but one thing I really want to call you guys, I really would like to recruit people to help Mike, because if you think in the areas where you are that you have unique discs that are valuable, other people should see them. They're not going to get in there unless, people really help with this. And he's helped me learn how to do the photos better. I don't know if you've looked at it online, but, actually mine are getting closer to his, not quite at his quality, but I'm getting better. And I hope someday I get to that level. But I close with just one thing. Ed and I had a very interesting relationship, and he didn't like some of the things I did, but he saw that I brought a lot of professionalism. I really tried to do this just the way I do my job, and I tried to be fair.